The maintenance hangar at Riverside Municipal Airport buzzed with the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday morning. Coffee-stained mechanics argued over engine diagnostics while administrative staff shuffled between clipboard duties and phone calls that never seemed to end. In the corner, near a stack of aviation manuals that hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration, Sarah Chen methodically organized inventory sheets with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to find purpose in the smallest details. What nobody at Riverside knew was that the soft-spoken woman in coveralls, who had been tracking aircraft parts for 3 years, had once been Captain Isabella Phoenix Martinez, one of the most decorated fighter pilots in Air Force history, until a classified mission over the South China Sea had officially killed her 10 years ago. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The transformation from Captain Martinez to Sarah Chen hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of careful planning, forged documents, and the kind of deep cover protocols that existed in the shadowy spaces between official military operations and plausible deniability. Isabella Martinez had been declared killed in action when her F-22 Raptor had vanished during a reconnaissance mission that officially never happened. The memorial service had been private, attended only by her squadron commander and a handful of intelligence officers who understood that some sacrifices were measured in anonymity rather than medals. Her parents had been told she died in a training accident. Her younger brother still left flowers at a grave that contained only an empty casket and carefully manufactured memories. But Isabella Martinez hadn't died in the South China Sea. She had discovered something during that mission, something that powerful people wanted buried deeper than any aircraft wreckage. The choice had been simple: disappear forever or watch everyone she cared about suffer the consequences of her discovery. So Captain Isabella Martinez had died officially, completely, and permanently, while Sarah Chen had been born in a small apartment in Oregon with a manufactured history and a heart full of secrets that could never be shared. The transition from supersonic fighter jets to inventory management had been more difficult than surviving enemy fire. Isabella had gone from commanding millions of dollars of cutting-edge military technology to counting bolts and washers in a civilian hangar that smelled like motor oil and broken dreams. Her hands, which had once guided precision-engineered aircraft through combat maneuvers at Mach 2, now held clipboards and calculators. Her mind, trained to process split-second tactical decisions while pulling 9Gs, now focused on parts requisitions and maintenance schedules that moved at the pace of small-town bureaucracy. The other employees at Riverside Municipal treated Sarah Chen with the polite indifference reserved for quiet people who did their jobs competently but without flair. She arrived precisely at 7:30 every morning, worked methodically through her assigned tasks, ate lunch alone while reading technical manuals that seemed too advanced for an inventory clerk, and left at exactly 5 p.m. She never complained about overtime, never asked for raises, and never participated in the casual conversations that bound the rest of the staff together. To them, she was simply Sarah, reliable, unremarkable, and utterly forgettable. What they couldn't see was the way her eyes automatically tracked every aircraft that took off or landed at the small regional airport. What they didn't notice was how she unconsciously calculated wind speeds and approach angles when planes struggled with crosswind landings. What they couldn't understand was why someone with her obvious technical knowledge was content to remain in a position that barely challenged a high school graduate's capabilities. Sarah Chen had become a master of deliberate mediocrity, carefully calibrating her performance to be good enough to avoid attention, but never so exceptional as to invite curiosity about her background. The morning routine at Riverside Municipal Airport followed the same predictable pattern that had governed Sarah's life for 3 years. The flight instructor, Dave Morrison, would arrive at 8 a.m. sharp, already complaining about student pilots who couldn't tell a rudder from an aileron. The charter service manager, Lisa Rodriguez, would spend her first hour trying to coordinate last-minute flight changes for clients who treated aviation scheduling like a suggestion rather than a science. The airport manager, Tom Bradley, would emerge from his office around 9 a.m. with coffee that had been brewing since the previous afternoon and a perpetual expression of mild confusion about how anything at the airport actually functioned. None of them paid particular attention to Sarah Chen as she moved through the hangar, checking inventory against shipping manifests and noting discrepancies with the methodical thoroughness that had once made her legendary among Air Force maintenance crews. They saw only a middle-aged woman with graying hair and sensible shoes, who kept their parts inventory organized and their paperwork current. They had no reason to suspect that the quiet clerk who reminded them to order replacement spark plugs had once been entrusted with aircraft worth more than the entire annual budget of their small airport. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she now worked with civilian aircraft that represented the technological equivalent of horse-drawn carriages compared to the sophisticated fighters she had once commanded. The single-engine Cessnas and aging Beechcraft that comprised most of Riverside's fleet moved at speeds that would have been considered hovering in her previous life. Their avionics systems were simpler than the calculators she'd used in flight school. Their maximum operating altitudes were lower than the minimum engagement envelope for the weapons systems she'd once mastered. But Sarah had learned to find satisfaction in smaller accomplishments. When she prevented a potentially dangerous maintenance oversight by catching a discrepancy in parts documentation, she felt the same focused satisfaction that had once accompanied successful mission completion. When she helped a nervous student pilot understand the importance of proper pre-flight inspection procedures, she experienced an echo of the pride she'd felt when training junior officers in advanced combat tactics. The scale had changed dramatically, but the fundamental commitment to aviation safety and excellence remained constant. The other employees occasionally wondered about Sarah's background. Her technical knowledge seemed unusually comprehensive for someone whose official resume showed only civilian aircraft experience. She could identify engine problems by sound alone, understood complex avionics troubleshooting procedures without consulting manuals, and demonstrated an intuitive grasp of aerodynamics that typically took years to develop. When pressed about her previous experience, Sarah would mention working for various charter services in the Pacific Northwest, locations remote enough and companies small enough that verification would be difficult and ultimately unnecessary. What really puzzled her colleagues was Sarah's complete disinterest in flying. Despite working at an airport where most employees held at least private pilot licenses, she had never expressed any desire to take flying lessons or even ride along on routine flights. When asked about it, she would smile politely and mention a mild fear of heights that made flying uncomfortable. The lie came easily after 3 years of practice, though it felt like a small betrayal each time she spoke it. Isabella Martinez had never feared anything in the sky. Sarah Chen had to pretend that heights made her nervous. The transformation had required more than just changing names and manufacturing a new identity. It had demanded that she fundamentally alter her relationship with the sky that had once been her natural environment. Where Captain Martinez had felt most alive at 40,000 feet pulling maximum G-forces in air-to-air combat training, Sarah Chen had to appear content with keeping her feet firmly planted on the ground. Where Isabella had thrived on the razor-edge precision required for carrier landings and tactical formation flying, Sarah had to seem satisfied with the mundane routine of inventory management and paperwork processing. The psychological adjustment had been more challenging than the physical aspects of her new identity. Isabella Martinez had been defined by her relationship with speed, altitude, and the kind of split-second decision-making that separated elite pilots from everyone else. Her entire sense of self had been built around her ability to master the most sophisticated aircraft ever designed, and to use that mastery in service of missions that mattered on a global scale. Sarah Chen had to find meaning in work that would have seemed impossibly tedious to her former self, while never allowing anyone to suspect the depth of knowledge and experience that she kept carefully hidden. But 10 years of practice had made the performance almost automatic. Sarah Chen had become as real as Isabella Martinez had ever been, complete with habits, preferences, and limitations that felt authentic because they had been lived daily for over a decade. She had learned to find genuine satisfaction in small accomplishments, real friendship in casual workplace relationships, and actual peace in the quiet anonymity that had once felt like a prison. The woman who had once commanded the skies had learned to be content with managing inventory in a small municipal airport hangar, surrounded by aircraft that moved slowly enough for ordinary people to understand and operate safely. As Sarah finished organizing the morning's delivery receipts and began preparing for the routine parts inspection that would occupy most of her day, she had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed new life was about to collide catastrophically with the skills and instincts that she had spent 10 years learning to suppress. The morning seemed destined to follow the same predictable pattern that had governed thousands of previous mornings at Riverside Municipal Airport. But sometimes the past refuses to remain buried, and sometimes the sky demands that its most skilled children return to serve, regardless of the personal cost or the promises they've made to remain safely on the ground. The control tower at Riverside Municipal Airport stood like a lonely lighthouse, overlooking the modest collection of runways and taxiways that served the surrounding agricultural communities. From her position near the parts storage area, Sarah could see air traffic controller Janet Walsh moving between radio equipment and radar displays with the casual efficiency of someone who had been managing small-town aviation for over 15 years. Janet's domain rarely challenged her with anything more complex than coordinating crop dusters during harvest season or guiding lost Cessna pilots back to their intended destinations. The most excitement Riverside typically experienced involved weekend recreational flyers who occasionally needed gentle reminders about proper radio protocols or aircraft spacing. The airport staff hierarchy reflected the relaxed atmosphere of a facility where everyone knew everyone else's business and most problems could be solved with a phone call and good-natured negotiation. Tom Bradley, the airport manager, had inherited his position more through longevity than ambition, having worked his way up from line service technician over the course of 20 years. His approach to management emphasized avoiding complications rather than pursuing excellence, and his staff had learned to appreciate the resulting lack of pressure and micromanagement. Problems that couldn't be ignored were usually delegated to whoever seemed most capable of handling them with minimal disruption to the airport's comfortable routine. Dave Morrison commanded the flight training operation with the easy authority of someone who had taught hundreds of student pilots the basics of aviation without ever losing his enthusiasm for introducing newcomers to the joy of flight. His office walls displayed decades of photographs showing nervous beginners posing beside training aircraft after successful first solo flights, their faces radiating the unique combination of terror and exhilaration that marked the transition from passenger to pilot. Dave's teaching philosophy emphasized patience, repetition, and the kind of fundamental safety consciousness that kept student pilots alive, while they learned to manage the complex coordination of skills required for safe flight operations. Lisa Rodriguez managed the charter service with the diplomatic skills of someone who regularly negotiated between demanding clients and the practical limitations of small aircraft operations. Her clientele included local business executives who needed quick transportation to regional meetings, emergency medical flights that couldn't wait for scheduled airline service, and occasional recreational charters for tourists wanting aerial views of the scenic river valleys that surrounded Riverside. Lisa had developed an impressive ability to explain aviation realities to clients who expected their personal aircraft to operate with the convenience and reliability of commercial airlines, while maintaining the customer service standards that kept charter operations profitable. The maintenance staff represented the heart of Riverside's operations, though their work remained largely invisible to pilots and passengers who took aircraft reliability for granted. Chief Mechanic Bob Williams had earned his airframe and power plant certification during the final years of the Vietnam War, when aircraft maintenance demanded both technical expertise and creative problem-solving under less than ideal conditions. His approach to aircraft servicing emphasized thorough inspection and conservative repair practices that prioritize safety over convenience or cost savings. Bob's team included 2 younger mechanics who brought more recent training to complement his decades of practical experience. Sarah's position within this hierarchy placed her at the intersection of all departments without granting her authority or visibility within any of them. Her inventory management responsibilities required coordination with maintenance for parts ordering, with charter operations for aircraft availability scheduling, and with administration for budget planning and vendor negotiations. But her role was purely supportive, designed to facilitate other people's work rather than to make independent decisions or exercise significant responsibility. It was the perfect position for someone who needed to remain professionally invisible while maintaining access to the technical aspects of aviation that still fascinated her despite the need for careful concealment. The social dynamics at Riverside reflected the comfortable familiarity of a workplace where turnover was low and relationships had developed over years of shared routine. Morning coffee conversations in the break room covered local news, family updates, and gentle gossip about community events. Lunch discussions often centered on aviation topics, interesting flights, unusual weather conditions, equipment problems, and the perpetual challenges of maintaining aging aircraft on limited budgets. Sarah participated in these conversations carefully, contributing enough technical knowledge to be helpful while avoiding the kind of detailed expertise that might prompt uncomfortable questions about her background. Her colleagues had gradually accepted Sarah's quiet competence without developing the kind of personal curiosity that could threaten her carefully maintained anonymity. They appreciated her reliability, respected her technical knowledge, and generally ignored her preference for privacy regarding her personal life and previous experience. In the small-town atmosphere of Riverside Municipal, where most employees lived within a few miles of the airport and had grown up in the surrounding communities, Sarah's status as an outsider was notable but not particularly unusual. The regional economy attracted enough transient workers that someone with a vague background and minimal local connections didn't automatically arouse suspicion. What her colleagues couldn't detect was the constant, low-level tension that governed Sarah's daily interactions with aircraft and aviation operations. Every conversation about flight planning triggered memories of missions that had required split-second navigation decisions over hostile territory. Every discussion of aircraft performance limitations reminded her of capabilities that far exceeded anything available at a civilian airport. Every reference to weather-related flight delays brought back experiences of flying in conditions that would have grounded every aircraft at Riverside permanently. The gap between her current environment and her previous experience created a persistent sense of cognitive dissonance that she had learned to manage, but never entirely eliminate. The technical aspects of her inventory work provided both comfort and frustration in equal measure. Sarah genuinely enjoyed the precision required for accurate parts tracking and the problem-solving involved in coordinating complex maintenance schedules. Her military training had emphasized attention to detail and systematic approaches to logistics management, skills that translated well to civilian aviation support operations. But the pace of civilian maintenance, constrained by budget limitations and non-urgent scheduling, often felt glacially slow compared to the rapid response requirements she had once considered normal. Aircraft at Riverside might remain grounded for weeks while waiting for cost-effective parts delivery, a delay that would have been completely unacceptable in any military context. The safety standards at Riverside met all regulatory requirements and reflected responsible civilian aviation practices, but they represented a significant departure from the redundant systems and conservative operating procedures that governed military flight operations. Civilian pilots routinely operated in weather conditions and with equipment configurations that would have triggered automatic mission cancellations in her previous environment. The risk tolerance that civilian aviation considered normal often struck Sarah as unnecessarily cavalier, though she had learned to suppress her instinctive concerns about operational practices that differed from military standards. Her relationship with the aircraft themselves remained complicated by the dramatic contrast between current and former capabilities. The civilian planes at Riverside were marvels of engineering within their intended parameters, representing decades of refinement in general aviation design and manufacturing. But compared to the sophisticated fighters she had once flown, they seemed almost primitive in their simplicity. Their avionics systems lacked the integrated complexity that had made air superiority possible. Their performance envelopes were constrained by safety margins that prioritized forgiveness over maximum capability. Their weapons systems were non-existent, replaced by navigation equipment designed for peaceful transportation rather than tactical engagement. The psychological challenge of working around aircraft while being unable to fly them had required constant management during her first year at Riverside. Sarah had developed elaborate strategies for avoiding situations that might tempt her to demonstrate knowledge or capabilities that exceeded her assumed background. She declined invitations to observe flight training sessions, avoided conversations about advanced flying techniques, and carefully limited her technical discussions to topics that a qualified inventory manager might reasonably understand. The self-imposed restrictions had become habitual after 3 years, but they still required conscious effort to maintain consistently. Dave Morrison had occasionally expressed puzzlement about Sarah's apparent lack of interest in learning to fly, especially given her obvious fascination with aircraft technical systems. His offers to provide introductory flight instruction at reduced cost had been politely but firmly declined, with references to financial constraints and scheduling conflicts that prevented her from pursuing pilot training. The excuses were plausible enough to avoid generating suspicion, but they represented a form of torture for someone who had once lived to fly, and who still dreamed nightly about the sensation of controlling powerful aircraft through three-dimensional space at incredible speeds. The administrative aspects of airport operations provided Sarah with insights into the broader aviation industry that helped her understand how completely she had been severed from her former world. Regulatory updates, industry news, and professional publications that circulated through Riverside's offices contained no references to the classified programs and advanced technologies that had once dominated her professional attention. The civilian aviation community operated in a parallel universe where the most sophisticated aircraft were business jets and the most complex operations involved coordinating multiple aircraft through controlled airspace during busy travel periods. This carefully constructed world of deliberate limitation and enforced anonymity had become Sarah's reality so completely that she sometimes struggled to remember the intense satisfaction she had once derived from pushing both herself and her aircraft to their absolute limits. The woman who had once thrived on the challenge of air-to-air combat training and precision formation flying had learned to find meaning in ensuring that Cessna training aircraft had properly documented maintenance histories and adequate spare parts inventories. It was a profound transformation that had required not just changing her identity, but fundamentally altering her relationship with her own capabilities and ambitions. But beneath the carefully cultivated contentment of Sarah, Chen's quiet life, Isabella Martinez's instincts and training remained intact. dormant but not dead, waiting for circumstances that might demand their resurrection, regardless of the personal cost or professional consequences that such a revelation might bring. Emergency began at exactly 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that had started like every other Tuesday at Riverside Municipal Airport. Sarah was cross-referencing engine parts inventory against maintenance schedules when the first Mayday call crackled through the control tower speakers with the kind of urgent desperation that cuts through routine like a knife through paper. Janet Walsh's voice, normally calm and measured during her routine communications with local traffic, suddenly carried the sharp edge of someone confronting a situation that exceeded all her training and experience. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 847, military transport aircraft experiencing catastrophic engine failure and hydraulic system malfunction. We have wounded personnel aboard requiring immediate medical attention. Requesting emergency landing clearance at any available facility. Our primary destination is no longer reachable. The transmission sent a shockwave through the small airport that Sarah felt in her bones before her conscious mind processed the implications. Military transport aircraft didn't normally operate anywhere near Riverside Municipal Airport. The nearest military installation was over 200 miles away, well beyond the operational radius of most transport planes experiencing the kind of serious mechanical problems described in the emergency call. Whatever had brought a damaged military aircraft into their airspace represented the kind of crisis that small civilian airports were never designed to handle. From her position near the parts storage area, Sarah could see Janet Walsh frantically consulting approach charts and runway specifications while simultaneously coordinating with regional air traffic control centers to clear airspace for the emergency landing attempt. The control tower, designed to handle the modest traffic volume of a rural airport, suddenly became the focal point for an operation that would challenge the capabilities of much larger facilities. Janet's radio communications revealed increasing concern about the feasibility of accommodating a large military transport aircraft on runways designed for much smaller civilian planes. Tom Bradley emerged from his office with the expression of someone whose comfortable routine had just collided with responsibilities he'd hoped never to face. As airport manager, he possessed theoretical authority over emergency operations, but his practical experience with military aircraft emergencies was limited to reading about them in aviation safety publications. The emergency response protocols that governed Riverside Municipal had been designed around scenarios involving single-engine training aircraft and small charter planes, not multi-engine military transports carrying wounded personnel and operating with compromised control systems. Flight 847, this is Riverside Municipal Airport, Janet transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the situation developing around her. We copy your emergency status. Be advised our primary runway is 6,000 feet with standard approach lighting. We're clearing all traffic and rolling emergency vehicles. Please confirm your aircraft type and number of souls aboard. The response carried the clipped professionalism of military aircrew trained to maintain communication discipline even under extreme stress. But Sarah's experienced ear detected the underlying tension that indicated a situation approaching the limits of crew capabilities. Riverside Municipal, Flight 847, is a C-130 Hercules with hydraulic failure, partial engine loss, and 14 souls aboard, including critical medical cases requiring immediate evacuation to trauma facilities. We're declaring minimum fuel and requesting vectors for the straight-in approach to your longest available runway. Sarah's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. A C-130 Hercules was a four-engine tactical transport aircraft designed for military operations in challenging environments. But even under optimal conditions, landing one at Riverside Municipal would push the airport's infrastructure to its absolute limits. with hydraulic failure compromising the aircraft's control systems and engine problems reducing available power. The margin for error would be essentially non-existent. The crew would have one chance to execute a precision approach, and landing on a runway that provided minimal safety buffer for an aircraft of that size and weight. Dave Morrison abandoned his morning flight instruction schedule and hurried toward the control tower, his face reflecting the concern of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the developing situation had become. His experience as a flight instructor had exposed him to various emergency scenarios involving small aircraft, but the prospect of a large military transport attempting an emergency landing at Riverside represented something far beyond his expertise or the airport's normal operational capabilities. The training aircraft that comprised most of his professional experience were toys compared to the sophisticated but damaged aircraft now approaching their airspace. Lisa Rodriguez began coordinating with local emergency services while simultaneously contacting regional hospitals to alert them about incoming casualties whose injuries and medical requirements remained unknown. Her charter service management experience had occasionally involved coordinating medical evacuation flights, but those operations typically used specially equipped aircraft with trained medical personnel aboard. The current situation involved wounded military personnel whose injuries might require trauma care capabilities that local medical facilities weren't equipped to provide, while being transported aboard an aircraft whose ability to complete a safe landing remained questionable. Bob Williams and his maintenance crew hurried to position emergency equipment along the runway while simultaneously reviewing technical manuals for information about C-130 systems and emergency procedures. Their experience with civilian aircraft maintenance provided some relevant background, but military transport planes operated with different systems, procedures, and performance characteristics that could affect emergency response requirements. The hydraulic failure mentioned in the emergency transmission could compromise multiple aircraft systems simultaneously, creating complex interactions that might not be immediately apparent to civilian maintenance personnel unfamiliar with military aircraft design. From her position in the parts storage area, Sarah found herself frozen between her carefully maintained identity as a civilian inventory clerk and her involuntary analysis of the tactical situation developing around the airport. Her knowledge of C-130 systems and emergency procedures was encyclopedic, acquired through years of military training that had emphasized understanding the capabilities and limitations of all aircraft types that might be encountered during combat operations. She knew that hydraulic failure in a C-130 could affect flight controls, landing gear operation, and braking systems simultaneously, creating a cascade of problems that required precise coordination between aircrew and ground support personnel. Sarah Chen was supposed to know nothing about military aircraft systems or emergency procedures. Her carefully constructed background included no experience with transport planes or combat operations. Any demonstration of knowledge about C-130 capabilities would immediately raise questions about her previous experience that she couldn't answer, without destroying the anonymity that had protected her for 10 years. The choice between maintaining her cover and potentially saving lives was becoming starker with each radio transmission from the approaching aircraft. The emergency communications revealed additional complications that made Sarah's internal conflict more acute. The C-130 crew reported that their wounded personnel included cases requiring immediate surgical intervention, suggesting combat injuries that might have resulted from recent military operations in hostile territories. The aircraft's fuel situation was becoming critical, eliminating any possibility of diverting to larger airports with better emergency facilities. Most importantly, the crew's radio transmissions indicated increasing difficulty maintaining aircraft control, suggesting that the hydraulic problems were worsening and might soon compromise their ability to execute any landing attempts successfully. Janet Walsh's coordination with regional air traffic control revealed the broader implications of the emergency. Weather conditions at alternative airports were deteriorating. Military rescue aircraft were too distant to provide immediate assistance, and the Co-130's mechanical problems were severe enough that continued flight posed increasing risks to the crew and wounded personnel aboard. Riverside Municipal Airport had become the only viable option for an aircraft whose successful landing would require precision, approaching the limits of both aircrew capability and airport infrastructure. The first visual contact with Flight 847 came at 12:15 p.m. when the damaged C-130 appeared as a distant speck against the afternoon sky, approaching from the northeast with an obviously abnormal flight profile. Through binoculars borrowed from Dave Morrison's flight training equipment, Sarah could see that the aircraft was flying lower and slower than normal for a C-130, with visible damage to one engine nacelle and an asymmetric configuration that indicated significant systems failures. The crew was maintaining control, but their approach path showed the careful, deliberate movements of pilots compensating for compromised aircraft systems through pure skill and determination. Tom Bradley's attempts to coordinate emergency response revealed the limitations of a small airport's crisis management capabilities. Local fire and rescue services were equipped for automobile accidents and residential emergencies, not aircraft crashes involving military personnel and unknown hazardous materials. The nearest trauma center was 40 minutes away by ambulance. Assuming that ground transportation would be appropriate for casualties whose injuries remained unknown, hospital helicopters that might provide faster medical evacuation were already committed to other emergencies and wouldn't be available for immediate response. The approaching C-130's radio transmissions became increasingly urgent as the crew dealt with worsening mechanical problems while attempting to configure their aircraft for landing at an airport that barely met their minimum operational requirements. Sarah could hear the stress in the pilot's voice as he requested detailed information about runway conditions, emergency equipment availability, and medical facilities, while simultaneously managing aircraft systems that were failing in real time. The professionalism of the military aircrew remained evident, but so did the mounting pressure of a situation that was approaching the edge of controlability. As Flight 847 entered the airport traffic pattern for its final approach, Sarah realized that her decade of carefully maintained anonymity was about to collide with circumstances that might demand every skill she had learned during her years as Captain Isabella Martinez. Regardless of the personal consequences that such a revelation might bring, the C-130 Hercules materialized through the afternoon haze like a wounded giant, its approach profile telling a story of desperation and declining options that Sarah could read as clearly as printed text. From her vantage point near the hangar, she watched the massive transport aircraft struggle to maintain stable flight as it lined up for what would be either a miraculous landing or a catastrophic crash at Riverside Municipal Airport. The aircraft's left outboard engine was clearly shut down, its propeller feathered and motionless, while black smoke streamed from what appeared to be hydraulic fluid burning on hot engine components. Janet Walsh's voice carried increasing tension as she guided the crippled aircraft through its final approach sequence, her normal air traffic control procedures adapted on the fly for an emergency that exceeded every training scenario she had ever encountered. Flight 847, you are cleared for emergency landing on runway 09. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Confirm your approach speed and landing configuration. The response from the Co-130's pilot revealed the extent of their mechanical crisis and the narrow margin for error that defined their situation. Riverside Municipal, Flight 847 is configured for emergency landing. We have partial hydraulic failure affecting flight controls and landing gear. Approach speed will be higher than normal due to control limitations. Be advised we may not be able to stop within normal distance parameters. Sarah's trained eye caught details that the civilian personnel around her couldn't interpret. The C-130's approach angle was steeper than standard, indicating that the crew was compensating for reduced engine power by trading altitude for airspeed. The aircraft's wings showed slight asymmetry, suggesting that hydraulic problems were affecting aileron control and forcing the pilots to use rudder inputs to maintain lateral stability. Most critically, the landing gear appeared to be only partially extended, with the main wheels visible but no clear indication that the gear was properly locked in position. Tom Bradley stood near the control tower with a portable radio, attempting to coordinate ground emergency response while simultaneously managing his own fear about the developing crisis. His authority as airport manager had never been tested by anything more challenging than noise complaints and budget disputes, but the approaching aircraft emergency was forcing him to make decisions that could affect the lives of 14 military personnel while potentially destroying the airport's infrastructure and endangering his own staff. Dave Morrison positioned himself near the runway threshold with emergency equipment that seemed pitifully inadequate for an aircraft weighing over 70,000 pounds and approaching at speeds that exceeded anything the small airport had ever handled. His experience with training aircraft emergencies had taught him the importance of immediate response to post-crash fires, but the scale of the approaching situation dwarfed every emergency scenario in his instructor training. The C-130's fuel load alone represented more potential fire hazard than all the aircraft at Riverside Municipal combined. Bob Williams and his maintenance crew deployed portable fire suppression equipment along the runway while reviewing emergency procedures that had been written for much smaller aircraft and less complex situations. Their civilian maintenance training included basic emergency response protocols, but military transport aircraft operated with different systems, higher performance parameters, and potential hazards that civilian mechanics rarely encountered. The possibility that the C-130 might be carrying military ordnance or classified equipment added layers of complexity that made their standard emergency procedures seem inadequate. Lisa Rodriguez coordinated frantically with regional medical facilities, trying to communicate the urgency of incoming casualties while lacking specific information about the nature or severity of their injuries. Her charter service experience had occasionally involved medical transport coordination, but those operations typically used dedicated air ambulance aircraft with trained medical personnel aboard. The current situation involved wounded military personnel whose injuries might result from combat operations, requiring trauma care capabilities that exceeded the resources of rural medical facilities. As the C-130 descended through 500 feet above ground level, Sarah found herself caught between her carefully maintained civilian identity and her involuntary analysis of technical problems that required immediate intervention. Her knowledge of C-130 systems told her that partial hydraulic failure could affect multiple critical aircraft functions simultaneously, creating cascading failures that might overwhelm even experienced military aircrew. The landing gear configuration, she observed, suggested mechanical problems that could prevent normal braking action, while the engine damage might reduce the crew's ability to execute a go-around if their first landing attempt failed. The aircraft's final approach revealed additional problems that made Sarah's internal conflict more acute. The C-130's descent rate was higher than optimal, indicating that the crew was struggling to maintain precise control over their flight path. The aircraft's lateral movements showed the characteristic oscillations of pilots compensating for degraded hydraulic systems through manual control inputs that required constant correction. Most critically, the approach speed was significantly faster than normal for a C-130, suggesting that the crew couldn't configure their aircraft for the slow, controlled landing that Riverside's short runway demanded. Janet Walsh's radio communications reflected growing concern about the feasibility of a successful landing as the magnitude of the aircraft's mechanical problems became apparent. Flight 847. Be advised your approach appears fast and steep. Confirm you are able to execute a safe landing within our available runway distance. We have emergency vehicles positioned, but limited firefighting capabilities for an aircraft of your size. The pilot's response carried the controlled tension of someone managing multiple system failures while approaching the limits of both aircraft capability and crew endurance. Riverside Municipal, we copy your concerns. Our control authority is limited due to hydraulic problems. We'll take whatever runway you can give us. These wounded need immediate medical attention, and we're running out of options for fuel and aircraft controllability. From her position near the parts storage area, Sarah could see emergency personnel taking positions that revealed their inexperience with large aircraft operations. The fire trucks were positioned too close to the runway, where jet blast from the Ka-130's remaining engines could overturn them or scatter debris that might damage the aircraft. The ambulances were staged in locations that would be inaccessible if the aircraft overran the runway or veered off course during landing rollout. Most critically, the emergency responders seemed unaware that a C-130's propellers continued spinning for several minutes after engines shut down, creating invisible hazards that could kill ground personnel who approached the aircraft prematurely. Bob Williams hurried between emergency vehicles, trying to coordinate positioning and procedures based on his limited knowledge of large aircraft operations. His civilian maintenance experience provided some relevant background, but military transport planes operated with different ground handling requirements, emergency procedures, and safety protocols that could affect both aircraft recovery and personnel safety. The hydraulic fluid leaking from the C-130 created additional fire hazards that required specialized cleanup procedures and safety equipment that Riverside Municipal didn't possess. The approaching aircraft's radio transmissions revealed that the crew was dealing with rapidly deteriorating mechanical conditions that threatened their ability to complete any landing attempt successfully. Warning lights were illuminating throughout the cockpit as hydraulic pressure continued dropping. Electrical systems showed signs of stress from compensating for failed components, and engine parameters indicated potential problems with the remaining functional power plants. The wounded personnel aboard required immediate medical attention, but the aircraft's mechanical problems were approaching the point where continued flight would be impossible regardless of destination. As the C-130 descended 200 feet above the runway threshold, Sarah realized that her 10 years of carefully maintained anonymity were about to collide with a crisis that might demand every skill she had acquired during her years as Captain Isabella Martinez. The approaching aircraft was in serious trouble, piloted by crew members who were running out of options while carrying wounded personnel who might die without immediate medical intervention. Riverside Municipal Airport's emergency response capabilities were being pushed far beyond their design limits, while civilian personnel struggled to manage a situation that exceeded their training and experience. The choice between maintaining her protective anonymity and potentially preventing a catastrophic aircraft accident was crystallizing with each foot of the C-130's descent toward the runway. Sarah Chen was supposed to remain invisible, unremarkable, and completely disconnected from the military aviation expertise that had once defined her professional identity. But Isabella Martinez's knowledge of C-130 systems and emergency procedures might be the difference between 14 people living or dying in the next few minutes. Regardless of what revealing that knowledge might cost her personally, the damaged transport aircraft continued its final approach toward a runway that offered minimal margin for error, piloted by crew members whose skill and determination were being tested against mechanical failures that pushed their aircraft toward the edge of controllability. In less than 60 seconds, everyone at Riverside Municipal Airport would discover whether civilian emergency procedures could handle a military aviation crisis, or whether the situation would demand intervention from someone whose expertise exceeded the limitations of small-town airport operations. The Ki-130's landing gear made contact with Riverside's runway at 12:28 p.m. with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through the ground and announced to everyone within miles that something extraordinary was happening at their quiet municipal airport. Sarah watched from the hangar doorway as the massive aircraft bounced once, settled heavily onto the asphalt, and immediately began demonstrating the control problems that had made the approach so precarious. The left main gear appeared to be partially collapsed or damaged, causing the aircraft to pull violently toward the left side of the runway while the crew fought to maintain directional control. Black smoke began streaming from the main landing gear as damaged brakes generated friction heat that could ignite hydraulic fluid and tire rubber within seconds. The Ki-130's remaining engines were still producing thrust and reverse, but the asymmetric configuration meant that engine power was contributing to the aircraft's tendency to veer off the runway rather than helping to slow it down. Sarah could see the nose gear oscillating as the pilots alternated between steering inputs and brake applications, trying to find some combination that would keep their aircraft on the pavement while bleeding off speed that threatened to carry them beyond the runway's safety margins. Janet Walsh's voice cut through the radio static with urgent instructions that reflected her growing realization that the emergency was escalating beyond anyone's ability to control it through normal procedures. Flight 847, you appear to be pulling left of runway centerline. Emergency vehicles are responding to your position. Advise your status and crew capabilities for evacuation procedures. The pilot's response came in fragments between the sounds of alarms and urgent crew communications that indicated multiple systems were failing simultaneously, as the aircraft's violent contact with the runway stressed components that were already operating beyond their design limits. Riverside losing directional control, hydraulic pressure dropping. Need immediate ... fire suppression on left main gear. Crew preparing for emergency evacuation. Tom Bradley stood frozen near the control tower, watching his airport's longest runway being torn apart by an aircraft whose landing weight and damaged systems were creating forces that the pavement had never been designed to handle. Deep gouges appeared in the asphalt where the C-130's damaged landing gear scraped against the surface, while hydraulic fluid created slick patches that further compromised the crew's ability to maintain control. The aircraft was slowing, but not quickly enough to prevent it from reaching the runway's end, where a shallow drainage ditch and chain-link fence represented the only barriers between the C-130 and the residential area beyond the airport. Boundary, Dave. Morrison ran toward the runway with a portable fire extinguisher that seemed laughably inadequate for the growing emergency. But his flight instructor instincts demanded some form of immediate action, even when rational analysis suggested that individual efforts would be meaningless against an aircraft fire involving thousands of gallons of fuel and hydraulic fluid. His experience with training aircraft emergencies had emphasized the importance of rapid response to prevent small problems from becoming catastrophic ones. But the scale of the developing C-130 emergency dwarfed every scenario in his instructor training. The airport's fire truck arrived at the runway just as the C-130's left main gear began generating sparks that ignited hydraulic fluid into flames that spread along the aircraft's belly and threatened to reach fuel lines or electrical systems. Bob Williams drove the fire suppression vehicle with the desperate urgency of someone who understood that aircraft fires could become uncontrollable within minutes, consuming everything aboard while preventing any possibility of rescue for crew members or passengers who might be trapped inside. His civilian firefighting training had covered basic aircraft fire suppression techniques, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the intensity and complexity of flames involving military transport aircraft systems. From her position near the hangar, Sarah could see that the civilian emergency response was already being overwhelmed by the magnitude and technical Complexity of the C-130's problems. The fire truck suppression capabilities were designed for small aircraft incidents, not transport planes carrying military fuel loads and potentially hazardous cargo. The ambulances were positioned too far from the aircraft to provide immediate medical support, while their crews lacked the specialized training required for evacuating wounded personnel from military aircraft during emergency conditions. Most critically, none of the civilian responders understood the technical systems and procedures that governed C-130 emergency operations. The aircraft continued its violent deceleration sequence, with the crew fighting multiple system failures, while attempting to prevent their transport from leaving the runway and potentially causing casualties among civilian emergency responders or nearby residents. Warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit as electrical systems strained to compensate for hydraulic failures, engine problems, and fire detection signals that indicated the aircraft situation was deteriorating faster than normal emergency procedures could address. The wounded personnel aboard needed immediate medical evacuation, but the aircraft's condition made normal passenger exit procedures impossible. Lisa Rodriguez coordinated frantically with regional medical facilities, trying to explain that 14 military casualties were about to require emergency treatment while lacking specific information about injury types, severity levels, or special medical requirements that might result from combat operations or exposure to military equipment. Her charter service experience had occasionally involved medical transport coordination, but civilian medical evacuation protocols weren't designed for wounded personnel who might have been exposed to classified operations or specialized military equipment that could affect their treatment requirements. As flames began spreading along the C-130's left side and the aircraft continued its uncontrolled deceleration toward the runway's end, Sarah felt her carefully maintained civilian identity cracking under the pressure of watching a preventable disaster unfold around her. Her knowledge of C-130 systems told her exactly what needed to be done to prevent the fire from reaching critical aircraft components, how to properly position emergency vehicles for maximum effectiveness, and which evacuation procedures would most appropriate for wounded military personnel under these specific conditions. But revealing that knowledge would immediately expose her true identity and destroy the anonymity that had protected her. For 10 years, the C-130's nose gear collapsed completely as the aircraft passed the 4,000-foot marker on Riverside's runway, sending the massive transport sliding forward on its belly while sparks from metal to asphalt. Contact ignited additional fires that began consuming rubber, hydraulic fluid, and electrical insulation. The crew's radio transmissions became increasingly urgent as cockpit smoke reduced visibility and fire. Warning systems indicated that flames were approaching fuel lines and electrical systems that could cause explosive failures, if not controlled immediately. Emergency evacuation procedures were being initiated, but the aircraft's position and ongoing fires made standard passenger exit protocols dangerous for both crew members and wounded personnel. Bob Williams positioned the fire truck as close to the burning aircraft as safety margins allowed, but the airport's single emergency vehicle lacked the capacity to suppress fires across the C-130's entire fuselage, while simultaneously cooling fuel systems and protecting evacuation routes. His civilian firefighting training emphasized preventing fire spread rather than aggressive suppression of established aircraft fires. But the C-130's fuel load and military systems created hazards that required techniques and equipment beyond Riverside Municipal's capabilities. Radio calls for mutual aid from regional fire departments would bring additional resources, but not quickly enough to prevent the current emergency from becoming a total loss. Janet Walsh coordinated with regional air traffic control to clear airspace for incoming emergency aircraft while simultaneously managing ground emergency communications that were becoming chaotic as multiple agencies responded to reports of a military Aircraft crash with unknown casualties and potential hazardous materials involvement. Her air traffic control training had covered basic emergency procedures, but coordinating multi-agency response to military aviation emergencies required protocols and authority structures that civilian controllers rarely encountered. The situation was rapidly expanding beyond the management capabilities of a small municipal airport. The C-130 finally came to rest, approximately 200 feet from the runway's end, positioned at an angle that blocked the airport's primary runway while fires continued, burning along its left side and belly. Emergency evacuation procedures were underway as crew members attempted to remove wounded personnel through exits that weren't compromised by fire or structural damage. But the aircraft's position made ambulance access difficult, while smoke and flame created hazards for both military personnel and civilian emergency responders. The situation demanded immediate, expert intervention to prevent loss of life, but the required expertise exceeded the capabilities of everyone present at Riverside Municipal Airport. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Chen stood at the hangar doorway, watching 14 lives hang in the balance while civilian emergency personnel struggled with procedures and equipment that were inadequate for the technical complexity of the crisis unfolding before them. The choice between maintaining her protective anonymity and potentially saving lives was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, urgent, and demanded a decision that would determine whether she remained Sarah Chen forever or became Isabella Martinez one last time to prevent a preventable tragedy from destroying everything she had spent 10 years trying to protect. Sarah's protective instincts shattered like glass as she watched Bob Williams position the inadequate fire truck too close to the C-130's burning engine, directly in the path of potential fuel explosion that could kill him and destroy their only firefighting capability. Without conscious thought, she found herself running toward the runway, her careful civilian demeanor abandoned as Captain Isabella Martinez's training took control of her actions. Her voice carried across the emergency scene with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command under crisis conditions. "Get that truck back 30 meters and approach from upwind," she shouted to Bob Williams, her technical knowledge surfacing automatically as she assessed the tactical situation with expert precision. "The fuel vapor cloud extends beyond your suppression range, and you're positioned directly in the blast zone if those wing tanks rupture." Bob turned toward her with confusion and surprise, his civilian firefighting training providing no context for understanding why the quiet inventory clerk was suddenly issuing orders with military precision and demonstrating knowledge of aircraft fire suppression techniques that exceeded his own expertise. But the absolute confidence in Sarah's voice and the technical accuracy of her assessment prompted him to reposition the fire truck without questioning her authority or demanding explanations that could waste precious seconds while lives hung in the balance. "Janet!" Sarah called toward the control tower while simultaneously running toward the burning aircraft. "Contact McCord Air Force Base immediately and request emergency medical evacuation for military wounded. Tell them you have a code black aircraft emergency with multiple combat casualties requiring immediate trauma care. Use those exact words, code black. They'll understand the priority level." Janet Walsh stared from the control tower windows at the transformation taking place below her, watching the reserved woman who had processed inventory paperwork for 3 years suddenly demonstrate command presence and technical expertise that seemed to emerge from nowhere. But the urgency of the developing crisis and the obvious competence of Sarah's instructions prompted immediate compliance with orders that clearly came from someone who understood military emergency procedures far better than anyone else at Riverside Municipal Airport. Sarah reached the C-130's forward section, just as crew members were attempting to evacuate the first wounded soldier through the crew entry door. a procedure that was taking far too long while fire continued, spreading along the aircraft's left side toward fuel lines and electrical systems. Her practiced eye immediately assessed the evacuation challenges. The aircraft's nose-down attitude made normal exit procedures difficult, while smoke and flame created hazards that required modified techniques for moving wounded personnel safely. "Sergeant, what's your medical status?" She called to the crew chief, who was coordinating passenger evacuation, while simultaneously monitoring aircraft systems that continued failing in sequence. Her military bearing and obvious familiarity with C-130 operations caused the crew chief to respond automatically with the kind of detailed status report that he would provide to any qualified military authority figure. "Ma'am, we have 3 critical casualties requiring immediate surgical intervention, 2 serious but stable injuries, and multiple walking wounded with various trauma conditions. Our medic is doing what he can, but we need trauma center capabilities for the critical cases. Aircraft fire is spreading toward the wing root area, and we're running out of time for safe evacuation." Sarah's mind processed the tactical situation with the systematic efficiency that had made her legendary among Air Force medical evacuation specialists during her active duty years. The wounded required immediate removal from the aircraft, but standard evacuation procedures weren't designed for the current combination of structural damage, fire hazards, and injured personnel who couldn't move independently. Modified techniques would be necessary to prevent evacuation procedures from causing additional injuries, while ensuring that everyone was removed before fire reached critical aircraft systems. "Dave," she called to the flight instructor who was standing helplessly near the runway threshold. "Position your truck at the aircraft's right rear exit and establish a clear evacuation route to the ambulances. Keep emergency vehicles between the wounded and the fire zone. Bob, continue foam application to the left engine area, but watch for electrical hazards. That aircraft has military-grade electrical systems that can arc through standard fire suppression foam." The civilian emergency responders found themselves responding automatically to Sarah's orders, her obvious expertise and command presence creating an organizational structure where chaos had prevailed moments earlier. Dave Morrison positioned emergency vehicles according to her instructions while Bob Williams adjusted his fire suppression techniques based on her warnings about electrical hazards that civilian firefighting training hadn't covered. The transformation of their disorganized emergency response into coordinated action was immediate and dramatic. Sarah climbed aboard the C-130 through the crew entry door, her movements demonstrating familiarity with aircraft layout and emergency procedures that clearly exceeded anything a civilian inventory clerk should possess. Inside the transport, she found controlled chaos as military crew members worked to stabilize wounded personnel while managing aircraft systems that continued deteriorating as fire spread through electrical conduits and hydraulic lines. The interior lighting had failed, leaving medical procedures dependent on flashlights and emergency illumination that made assessment and treatment extremely difficult. "Corman, give me a quick triage assessment," she ordered the aircraft's medical technician, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing multiple casualties under adverse conditions. "Critical cases first. What are we dealing with for immediate life-threatening injuries? And what's your time frame for safe evacuation before aircraft systems become completely compromised?" The military medic responded with professional efficiency, recognizing Sarah's obvious medical and aviation expertise, even though her civilian clothing provided no indication of military background or training. "Ma'am, we have 1 penetrating abdominal trauma requiring immediate surgery, 1 severe head injury with declining consciousness, and 1 multiple fracture case with significant blood loss. The walking wounded can self-evacuate, but these 3 need careful handling and immediate trauma center capabilities." Sarah's medical training automatically prioritized the casualties based on injury severity and evacuation requirements, while her aviation knowledge calculated the time available before aircraft fire would make evacuation impossible. The penetrating abdominal trauma represented the most immediately life-threatening condition, but the head injury case required careful spinal immobilization during movement. The multiple fracture patient needed pain management and bleeding control before attempting evacuation through damaged aircraft exits. "Start moving the walking wounded immediately through the right rear exit," she instructed while simultaneously examining the most critical casualties with hands that moved with the sure confidence of extensive combat medical experience. "I'll handle the critical cases. We need spine boards and trauma equipment from the ambulances. But don't waste time trying to bring standard hospital equipment. Aboard, work with what we have and prioritize speed over perfect technique." Tom Bradley watched from his position near the control tower as Sarah coordinated evacuation procedures with expertise that transformed the entire emergency response operation. Her obvious familiarity with military aircraft systems and medical procedures had created organizational efficiency, where civilian emergency protocols had been overwhelmed by the complexity and scale of the crisis. But her demonstration of knowledge far beyond anything consistent with her official background was raising questions that would demand answers once the immediate emergency was resolved. Inside the C-130, Sarah worked with systematic precision to stabilize the most critical casualties, while preparing them for evacuation under conditions that challenged every aspect of her medical and aviation training. The penetrating abdominal trauma required immediate bleeding control and fluid resuscitation using equipment that was available aboard the aircraft, but needed expert application under emergency conditions. The head injury case demanded careful monitoring of consciousness levels while ensuring that spinal alignment was maintained during the difficult process of removing him from the damaged aircraft. "Sergeant, I need you to coordinate with ground personnel for immediate helicopter evacuation of these critical cases," she instructed the crew chief while simultaneously managing IV fluid administration and wound care procedures. "Contact your command authority and request immediate medical helicopter response with trauma team capabilities. These casualties can't survive ground transport to regional hospitals. They need flight direct to Level 1 trauma centers." The crew chief responded to her orders without questioning her authority or requesting identification, her obvious expertise and command presence creating automatic military compliance, even though her civilian status should have precluded any involvement in military emergency operations. Radio communications were initiated with military medical evacuation assets, while ground personnel prepared to receive casualties whose injuries exceeded the treatment capabilities of civilian emergency medical services. Lisa Rodriguez coordinated with regional trauma centers while simultaneously managing logistics for helicopter landing zones and medical equipment requirements that exceeded her previous charter service experience. Sarah's expert triage and medical assessment had provided specific information about injury types and treatment requirements that allowed proper coordination with trauma specialists who understood combat wound management and military medical evacuation procedures. As smoke continued filling the C-130's interior and fire spread closer to critical aircraft systems, Sarah realized that her decade of protective anonymity was ending in the most public way possible, witnessed by civilian and military personnel, who would inevitably investigate her background and discover the discrepancy between her official identity and her obvious expertise. But 14 lives hung in the balance, and some promises transcended personal protection or career consequences. The evacuation continued with increasing urgency as aircraft systems failed and fire approached fuel lines that could cause explosive destruction of the entire transport, taking everyone aboard with it. The evacuation of the 3 critical casualties required every technique Sarah had learned during her most challenging combat medical operations, adapted for the unique hazards of a burning aircraft with compromised structural integrity. She directed the careful removal of the abdominal trauma patient first, coordinating with Dave Morrison and Bob Williams to establish a smooth transfer route that minimized movement while maintaining pressure on bleeding wounds that could prove fatal if emergency procedures caused additional tissue damage. The patient's blood pressure was dropping despite 4 fluid resuscitation, indicating internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention beyond anything available at Riverside Municipal Airport. Keep constant pressure on that abdominal. Dressing and monitor his breathing, Sarah instructed Dave Morrison as they transferred the wounded soldier onto a spine board that had been retrieved from one of the ambulances. If his respiratory rate drops below 12 or increases above 30, we're losing him. Radio ahead to the trauma center and tell them to have an operating room standing by for emergency abdominal surgery with multiple penetrating wounds. The head injury case presented different challenges that tested Sarah's neurological assessment skills under conditions where standard monitoring equipment was unavailable and evacuation procedures could exacerbate brain trauma through improper handling. The soldier's consciousness level had declined during the time since aircraft landing, suggesting increasing intracranial pressure that could cause permanent brain damage or death if evacuation procedures weren't executed with perfect precision. Spinal immobilization was critical, but so was rapid transport to neurosurgical facilities that could relieve pressure and prevent irreversible neurological damage. This one needs helicopter evacuation directly to a Level 1 trauma center with neurosurgical capabilities, Sarah told Tom Bradley as they positioned the head injury patient for transfer to the aircraft exit. Ground transport will take too long, and every minute of delay increases the probability of permanent brain damage. Contact the nearest military installation and request immediate medical helicopter response with a trauma team aboard. The multiple fracture patient required pain management and bleeding control before attempting movement through the damaged aircraft's challenging exit configuration. Sarah administered morphine from the C-130's medical kit while simultaneously applying pressure, dressings to control hemorrhaging from compound fractures that had severed blood vessels and created ongoing fluid loss. The soldier remained conscious, but was showing signs of shock that indicated his condition was deteriorating despite initial stabilization efforts. We need to splint these fractures before moving him, but we don't have time for perfect immobilization, Sarah explained to the aircraft's medical technician while working to stabilize the most severe injuries. Priority is controlling bleeding and preventing additional tissue damage during evacuation. Pain management is secondary to maintaining blood pressure and preventing shock from progressing to cardiac arrest. As the evacuation continued, Sarah found herself automatically coordinating between military crew members and civilian emergency responders with the kind of seamless authority that came from years of commanding complex operations under extreme pressure. Her instructions were technically precise, medically appropriate, and delivered with the calm confidence that prevented panic while ensuring that everyone understood their responsibilities in saving lives that hung in the balance. But her demonstration of expertise far beyond anything consistent with civilian inventory management was creating obvious questions among both military and civilian personnel. The Ka-130's crew chief approached Sarah as she supervised the transfer of the third critical casualty, his expression reflecting both gratitude for her life-saving intervention and curiosity about her background and qualifications. "Ma'am, I need to ask, what's your military experience? Your knowledge of C-130 systems and combat medical procedures suggests training that goes way beyond civilian emergency response. My crew needs to know who we're working with here." Sarah continued monitoring the fracture patient's vital signs while considering her response to a question that could no longer be avoided or deflected through the careful evasions that had protected her identity for 10 years. The immediate medical emergency took precedence over personal concerns. But she was acutely aware that her cover was disintegrating in real time as more people witnessed her obvious military expertise. Every instruction she gave, every procedure she performed, every decision she made was inconsistent with the background of a civilian airport employee. "Right now, I'm someone trying to save your wounded," she replied without looking up from her patient care. "We can discuss credentials after everyone is safely evacuated and receiving proper medical treatment. Your priority should be coordinating with your command authority for helicopter evacuation and ensuring that trauma centers are prepared for incoming casualties with combat-related injuries." Janet Walsh coordinated frantically with military and civilian medical facilities while simultaneously managing air traffic control responsibilities that had expanded far beyond normal small airport operations. Her radio communications included coordination with military helicopter assets, regional trauma centers, and emergency management agencies, whose capabilities were being stretched by the complexity and scale of the C-130 emergency. Sarah's expert triage and medical assessment had provided specific information that allowed proper coordination with trauma specialists, but questions about her background and authority were beginning to surface among the agencies responding to the emergency. The fire suppression operations continued under Bob Williams' direction, but the C-130's military-grade electrical systems and fuel configuration created hazards that challenged civilian firefighting techniques and equipment. Sarah's warnings about electrical arcing through fire suppression foam had prevented potentially fatal accidents, while her knowledge of aircraft fuel system layout had guided foam application to prevent fire spread to critical components. But her demonstrated expertise with military aircraft systems was raising questions about how a civilian inventory clerk possessed such specialized knowledge. As the last of the critical casualties was transferred from the burning aircraft ground emergency vehicles, Sarah realized that helicopter evacuation would be necessary to ensure survival of the most severely injured soldiers. Regional hospitals lacked the trauma surgery and neurosurgical capabilities required for combat-related injuries, while ground transport would consume time that the critical cases couldn't afford. Military medical evacuation assets would provide the rapid transport and specialized care necessary to save lives, but requesting such resources would inevitably trigger investigations into the circumstances of the emergency and the qualifications of the civilian personnel who had coordinated the evacuation. "Tom, you need to contact McCord Air Force Base immediately and request a priority medical evacuation helicopter response," Sarah instructed the airport manager while simultaneously checking on the walking wounded who had been evacuated earlier and were receiving basic medical attention from civilian emergency medical technicians. Use emergency authorization codes Alpha-7-7-Charlie for immediate trauma team response. Tell them you have multiple combat casualties requiring immediate flight to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Tom Bradley stared at Sarah with growing confusion and concern. Her casual use of military authorization codes and detailed knowledge of specialized medical evacuation procedures, creating obvious inconsistencies with her civilian background and employment history. But the urgency of the medical emergency and the obvious accuracy of her instructions prompted compliance with orders that clearly came from someone with extensive military experience, regardless of the questions that such expertise raised about her true identity. The military helicopter response arrived within 40 minutes, bringing trauma medical teams and specialized equipment that could provide definitive care during flight to advanced trauma facilities. Sarah coordinated the transfer of critical casualties with the helicopter crews, her obvious familiarity with military medical evacuation procedures creating seamless integration between ground emergency operations and flight medical care. But her demonstration of expertise that exceeded anything consistent with civilian training was becoming impossible to ignore or explain through normal emergency response protocols. "Ma'am, we need to talk," the C-130's aircraft commander said as he approached Sarah following the successful evacuation of all wounded personnel. "Your knowledge of our aircraft systems and medical procedures suggests a military background that goes well beyond standard civilian training. My crew and I are grateful for your intervention, but official reports are going to require information about your qualifications and authority to coordinate military emergency operations." Colonel Patricia Hayes stepped off the medical evacuation helicopter with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority and complex emergency operations, but her expression reflected curiosity about the civilian coordinator whose expert management had saved lives and prevented a potential catastrophe. Her initial briefing had described a C-130 emergency at a civilian airport with casualties evacuated through the efforts of local emergency personnel. But the technical precision and military expertise demonstrated during the operation suggested involvement by someone with extensive military training and combat experience. Sarah found herself facing the inevitable moment when her carefully maintained civilian identity would collide with official military investigation procedures that would expose her true background and destroy the anonymity that had protected her for 10 years. But 14 military personnel were alive because she had chosen to act despite the personal consequences. And some decisions transcended career protection or personal safety when American lives hung in the balance. Colonel Patricia Hayes surveyed the emergency scene with the analytical precision of someone who had commanded medical evacuation operations across 3 war zones. But nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for the reports she was receiving about a civilian inventory clerk who had somehow coordinated a complex military aircraft emergency with expertise that exceeded most active duty personnel. The C-130 crew chief's initial debrief had described emergency procedures executed with textbook precision by someone who demonstrated intimate knowledge of aircraft systems, combat medical protocols, and military evacuation procedures that weren't taught in any civilian training program. "Ms. Chen, I presume?" Colonel Hayes approached Sarah with the measured courtesy of someone who understood that official investigations sometimes uncovered information that challenged comfortable assumptions about identity and background. "I'm Colonel Hayes, commanding officer of the 62nd Medical Wing. I understand we owe you a considerable debt of gratitude for your intervention today, but I'm also receiving reports that suggest training and experience that would be unusual for civilian airport personnel." Sarah stood near the damaged C-130, her civilian clothing smoke-stained and her hands still bearing traces of blood from treating wounded soldiers, knowing that her decade of protective anonymity was ending in the most public way possible. The transformation from Sarah Chen to whatever she would become next was inevitable, witnessed by dozens of military and civilian personnel, whose official reports would document capabilities that couldn't be explained through normal career histories or standard emergency response training. "Colonel, I did what needed to be done to save American lives," Sarah replied with quiet dignity, her voice carrying undertones of military bearing that had been carefully suppressed for 10 years, but now emerged automatically under direct questioning from senior military authority. The wounded soldiers required immediate medical intervention, and civilian emergency services needed coordination to prevent additional casualties. Everything else is secondary to the fact that 14 people are alive who might not have been without immediate expert intervention. Colonel Hayes studied Sarah with the focused attention of someone trained to read between the lines of official statements and recognize when important information was being withheld or carefully managed. The woman standing before her demonstrated command presence, technical expertise, and medical knowledge that suggested extensive military training, but her official background showed only civilian employment history at a small municipal airport. The discrepancy raised questions that would require investigation, regardless of the successful outcome of the current emergency. "Ms. Chen, your coordination of medical evacuation procedures today saved lives and prevented a potential catastrophe." Colonel Hayes acknowledged while simultaneously noting details that would be included in her official report. "However, your knowledge of C-130 systems, combat medical protocols, and military evacuation procedures suggests training that goes well beyond civilian emergency response capabilities. I'm going to need you to provide detailed information about your background and qualifications for my official investigation." The crowd of civilian and military personnel who had witnessed Sarah's transformation from quiet inventory clerk to expert emergency coordinator gathered at respectful distances, their conversations reflecting amazement at capabilities that had seemed to emerge from nowhere when lives hung in the balance. Tom Bradley stood with Janet Walsh and Dave Morrison, comparing their observations about Sarah's demonstrated expertise with their previous assumptions about her background and qualifications. Bob Williams discussed aircraft fire suppression techniques with military personnel who were impressed by his coordination with someone who clearly understood advanced emergency procedures. Sarah realized that her carefully constructed civilian identity was dissolving under scrutiny that would inevitably reveal the truth about Captain Isabella Martinez's supposed death and subsequent disappearance from official military records. The investigation that would follow Colonel Hayes's report would uncover classified information that powerful people had wanted buried, potentially exposing not only her own survival, but the circumstances that had forced her to fake her death and assume a new identity 10 years ago. "Colonel, I understand your need for official documentation," Sarah said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that everything she said would be recorded and analyzed by investigators whose authority exceeded anything she could resist or deflect. "But I hope you'll also understand that some background information involves classified operations and personnel security considerations that extend beyond the current emergency situation." The mention of classified operations caused Colonel Hayes to reassess both Sarah's status and the potential implications of her investigation, recognizing that routine emergency response documentation might intersect with sensitive military operations or intelligence activities that required different handling procedures. Her experience with special operations medical support had taught her that some personnel maintained cover identities for security reasons, and that official investigations could inadvertently compromise ongoing operations or expose individuals to retaliation for their previous service. "Ms. Chen, are you suggesting that your background involves operations or activities that remain classified?" Colonel Hayes asked with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that inadvertent disclosure of sensitive information could have consequences extending far beyond immediate emergency response documentation. "Because if that's the case, my investigation procedures will need to accommodate security considerations that might not be immediately apparent from standard personnel records." Before Sarah could respond, a black SUV with government license plates arrived at the airport's emergency staging area, discharging two individuals in civilian suits, whose bearing and positioning suggested federal law enforcement or intelligence agency affiliation. Their immediate focus on Sarah and Colonel Hayes indicated that news of the C-130 emergency and the civilian coordinator's unusual capabilities had already reached agencies with broader authority and different investigative priorities than standard military emergency response protocols. Special Agent Marcus Webb approached the group with credentials that identified him as FBI. But his obvious familiarity with military operations and his specific knowledge of the current situation suggested involvement with agencies or programs that operated in the shadowy intersection between civilian law enforcement and classified military activities. His partner, Agent Sarah Collins, positioned herself to observe the assembled personnel while maintaining RADIO contact with agencies whose identity remained undisclosed, but whose interest in the current situation was clearly more than routine. "Colonel Hayes, Agent Webb, FBI," he announced with professional courtesy. That didn't disguise his authority to assume control of investigations that involved national security considerations. We're here regarding reports of unusual circumstances surrounding today's aircraft emergency, specifically involving civilian personnel who demonstrated capabilities inconsistent with their official background and employment history. We'll need to speak with Ms. Chen immediately regarding her involvement in coordinating military emergency operations. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in as federal investigators arrived to pursue questions that would inevitably expose her true identity and the classified circumstances that had forced her disappearance from official military records. The choice between maintaining her protective anonymity and saving American lives had been made hours ago, but the consequences were beginning to materialize in the form of official investigations that could endanger not only her own security but potentially compromise other personnel who remained involved in classified operations. Agent Webb, I assume you understand that Ms. Chen's intervention today saved 14 American lives and prevented a potential catastrophe that could have resulted in civilian casualties, Colonel Hayes said with the diplomatic firmness of someone who understood interagency politics but wasn't willing to allow investigative procedures to overshadow the positive outcome of the current emergency. Whatever questions you have about her background should be balanced against her demonstrated service to military personnel under extremely challenging conditions. Agent Webb consulted documentation that suggested his investigation had begun before his arrival at Riverside Municipal Airport, indicating that Sarah's activities had triggered automated surveillance or monitoring systems that flagged civilian personnel who demonstrated unusual capabilities during military-related incidents. His knowledge of details about the emergency response suggested access to real-time intelligence, gathering capabilities that exceeded normal law enforcement resources, and indicated involvement by agencies with broader authority and different mission priorities. Ms. Chen, we're going to need you to accompany us for detailed debriefing regarding your involvement in today's emergency operations, Agent Webb announced with the polite authority of someone whose requests weren't really optional. Our preliminary investigation has raised questions about your background and qualifications that require resolution through appropriate channels with proper security protocols and classified information handling procedures. Sarah looked around the emergency scene where civilian and military personnel continued coordinating recovery operations for the damaged C-130 while medical evacuation helicopters transported wounded soldiers to trauma centers that could provide the specialized care necessary for survival. Her decision to reveal her true capabilities had saved lives, but had also exposed her to investigative scrutiny that would ultimately destroy the protective anonymity she had maintained for 10 years. But 14 American soldiers were alive because she had chosen to act despite the personal consequences. I understand the necessity for your investigation, Sarah said with quiet dignity, knowing that her time as Sarah Chen was ending, and uncertain what would emerge from the official processes that would determine her future status and identity. But I hope you'll also understand that my primary concern today was saving American lives, and that some decisions transcend personal security considerations. When people are dying, an immediate expert intervention can make the difference between life and death. As federal agents prepared to escort Sarah away from the airport where her carefully constructed civilian life was ending, she realized that Isabella Martinez's story was far from over, and that some promises to serve and protect American military personnel couldn't be abandoned regardless of the personal cost or the official consequences that might result from honoring commitments that transcended career security and bureaucratic convenience. The FBI field office in Seattle occupied 3 floors of a downtown federal building that processed the kind of sensitive investigations requiring isolation from normal law enforcement channels and public scrutiny. Sarah found herself in an interview room designed for subjects whose cases involved national security implications. surrounded by recording equipment and communication systems that connected to agencies whose acronyms she recognized but whose current interest in her situation remained deliberately vague. Agent Webb and Agent Collins had maintained professional courtesy during the 2-hour drive from Riverside Municipal Airport, but their questions had revealed knowledge of her background that extended far beyond anything that should have been available through normal investigative channels. Ms. Chen, our preliminary investigation has uncovered some interesting discrepancies in your employment history and background documentation. Agent Webb began as he arranged classified folders whose contents remained hidden but whose thickness suggested extensive prior knowledge of her situation. Specifically, we found inconsistencies between your official civilian identity and capabilities that you demonstrated during today's emergency response. We're hoping you can help us understand how someone with your documented background acquired the expertise necessary to coordinate complex military operations. Sarah sat across the metal table from federal investigators whose authority to determine her future was absolute, knowing that her responses would either explain away the discrepancies or confirm suspicions that would trigger investigations into classified operations that powerful people had spent 10 years trying to keep buried. The comfortable anonymity of Sarah Chen had protected her from exactly this kind of official scrutiny, but her decision to save 14 American lives had exposed her to consequences that she had always known were inevitable if her true identity was ever discovered. Agent Webb, I provided emergency assistance to wounded American military personnel using whatever knowledge and capabilities I possessed. Sarah replied with careful precision, understanding that every word would be analyzed for implications that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of the C-130 emergency. My primary concern was preventing loss of life and coordinating emergency services to ensure that injured soldiers received appropriate medical care. I'm not sure why that would require a federal investigation unless there are aspects of this situation that I don't understand. Agent Collins consulted documentation that appeared to include surveillance reports, background investigations, and communication intercepts that suggested Sarah's activities had been monitored for longer than just the current emergency. Her questions revealed knowledge of details about Sarah's employment at Riverside Municipal Airport that indicated ongoing observation rather than investigation triggered by recent events. The implication that her civilian identity had been under scrutiny raised disturbing questions about what agencies knew about her true background and why they had allowed her to maintain her assumed identity for 10 years. Ms. Chen, we have reports indicating that you demonstrated intimate knowledge of C-130 aircraft systems, advanced combat medical procedures, and military emergency protocols that aren't taught through civilian training programs, Agent Collins said while reviewing documents whose classification markings were visible despite attempts to keep their contents hidden. Additionally, your coordination of emergency response operations included use of military authorization codes and communication procedures that suggest training and experience far beyond anything consistent with your official employment history. The federal building security systems included countermeasures against electronic surveillance that ensured their conversation remained private from outside monitoring. But Sarah was acutely aware that her statements were being recorded and would be analyzed by agencies whose interest in her case might extend far beyond understanding her role in the aircraft emergency. The investigation was expanding beyond routine background verification into territory that could expose classified operations and personnel whose security depended on maintaining the fiction that certain events had never happened and certain people had never existed. Agent Collins, I understand your need to verify my background and qualifications, Sarah said with growing concern about the direction of their investigation and its potential implications for other personnel who remained involved in classified operations. But I'm curious about why a routine emergency response has triggered a federal investigation and what agencies are involved in analyzing My actions during a situation where American lives were at stake. It seems like your investigation began before today's emergency, which raises questions about why my activities have been under surveillance. Agent Webb exchanged glances with his partner that suggested their investigation involved information or authorities that hadn't been fully disclosed, indicating that Sarah's case was connected to broader operations or ongoing investigations that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of her intervention during the C-130 emergency. The careful coordination of their questioning and the obvious preparation of their documentation suggested advanced knowledge of her background that challenged the assumption that her true identity had remained successfully hidden for 10 years. "Miss Chen, we're going to be direct with you," Agent Webb said as he opened one of the classified folders and revealed documents that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Our investigation indicates that you are actually Captain Isabella Martinez, United States Air Force, officially declared killed in action 10 years ago during a classified mission over the South China Sea. We know about your survival, your assumed identity, and the circumstances that forced you to disappear from official military records. What we need to understand is whether your current activities represent a security threat or unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The revelation that federal investigators knew her true identity destroyed any remaining hope that she could return to the protective anonymity of Sarah Chun's quiet civilian life. The existence of documentation proving her survival meant that other agencies were also aware of her situation, potentially including the same powerful interests that had forced her to fake her death 10 years ago. The investigation was no longer about her role in the aircraft emergency, but about her continued existence and the security implications of her unauthorized survival. Agent Webb, if you know about Captain Martinez, then you also know about the classified mission that officially killed her, and the circumstances that made her disappearance necessary for personnel security," Sarah replied with the careful precision of someone who understood that classified information required protection even during federal investigation. "I assume your investigation includes knowledge of the operations and intelligence activities that created the need for that disappearance, and the ongoing security considerations that have made maintaining a civilian identity necessary for survival." Agent Collins leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose investigation had uncovered information that challenged comfortable assumptions about classified operations and government accountability. "Ms. Martinez, our investigation suggests that your supposed death was arranged to prevent disclosure of intelligence activities that violated international law and threatened to expose ongoing operations in the South China Sea region. We believe that powerful interests arranged your disappearance to prevent congressional investigation and public disclosure of authorized military activities. The federal investigators' knowledge of the classified circumstances surrounding her supposed death indicated that their investigation extended into areas of government operations that were normally protected from routine law enforcement scrutiny." Sarah realized that her case had become a focal point for broader questions about accountability, oversight, and the methods used to protect classified programs from exposure through congressional investigation or public disclosure. Her survival represented evidence of operations that some agencies wanted exposed and others needed to keep buried. "Agents, I understand that my situation raises complex questions about classified operations and government accountability," Sarah said with growing awareness that her case had become part of larger political and institutional conflicts that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. "But my primary concern today was saving American lives, and my actions during the aircraft emergency were motivated by commitment to military personnel who needed immediate medical assistance. Whatever broader implications my survival might have for ongoing investigations or political accountability shouldn't overshadow the fact that 14 soldiers are alive because someone with appropriate training was available to coordinate their evacuation." Agent Webb consulted additional documentation that suggested coordination with multiple agencies whose involvement indicated that Sarah's case had triggered high-level attention from intelligence community leadership and congressional oversight. Committees interested in investigating classified programs that had operated without proper authorization or supervision. The scope of their investigation was expanding beyond routine background verification into territory that could expose systemic problems with oversight and accountability in classified military operations. Ms. Martinez, we're prepared to offer you federal protection and a new official identity in exchange for your cooperation with ongoing investigations into the classified programs that necessitated your disappearance 10 years ago. Agent Collins announced with the authority of someone whose offer represented coordination with agencies at the highest levels of government. Your testimony about unauthorized operations and intelligence activities could be crucial for congressional oversight and accountability measures that are currently being developed. Sarah realized that her decision to save 14 American lives had exposed her not only to investigation, but to recruitment by federal agencies whose interest in her case was motivated by larger political objectives rather than concern for her personal security or the circumstances that had forced her to assume a civilian identity. The offer of protection and official identity represented an opportunity to emerge from anonymity, but it also meant becoming a witness in investigations that could expose other personnel to retaliation and compromise ongoing operations that might still serve legitimate national security purposes. The choice between continued anonymity and official protection would determine not only her own future, but potentially affect other personnel whose service in classified programs depended on maintaining operational security and protecting classified information from unauthorized disclosure. Regardless of the political implications or institutional accountability concerns that motivated federal investigations into programs that operated in the shadows of official oversight and public scrutiny. 6 months after the C-130 emergency at Riverside Municipal Airport, Sarah Chen had officially ceased to exist for the second time in her life. But unlike her previous disappearance, this transformation had been accomplished through federal witness protection protocols rather than elaborate deception and forged documents. The woman who now lived in a modest apartment overlooking Puget Sound bore the legal name of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, complete with medical credentials that allowed her to work as a trauma consultant at Harborview Medical Center, where her expertise in combat medicine had already saved dozens of lives without anyone questioning how a recently relocated physician possessed such extensive knowledge of battlefield trauma care. The federal protection program had provided more than just a new identity. It had offered Isabella Martinez the opportunity to return to meaningful work that utilized her medical training while maintaining the security protocols necessary to protect her from the powerful interests that had originally forced her disappearance. Dr. Elena Rodriguez worked exclusively in emergency medicine, treating casualties whose injuries challenged the capabilities of civilian trauma teams, while avoiding the kind of high-profile positions that might attract unwanted attention from agencies or individuals who preferred that Captain Isabella Martinez remained officially dead. The congressional testimony that had earned her federal protection had exposed a network of unauthorized intelligence operations in the South China Sea that violated international law and threatened to compromise ongoing diplomatic negotiations with regional allies. Her detailed knowledge of classified programs and their operational methods had provided investigators with evidence of systematic abuse of congressional oversight authority and deliberate concealment of activities that exceeded authorized mission parameters. The resulting congressional hearings had led to senior leadership changes in multiple agencies and new oversight protocols designed to prevent similar unauthorized operations. But the political victories that had resulted from her Testimony came with personal costs that reminded her daily of the price of challenging powerful institutional interests. 3 former colleagues who had been involved in the same classified programs had died in apparent accidents within weeks of her congressional appearance, while 2 others had disappeared completely from their assigned positions without explanation or forwarding information. The message was clear: cooperation with congressional oversight carried risks that federal protection could mitigate, but not eliminate entirely. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had learned to find satisfaction in work that mattered without seeking recognition or advancement that might compromise her security. Her trauma surgery skills had saved lives that would have been lost without her intervention, while her experience with combat medicine had improved emergency procedures at one of the nation's premier trauma centers. The medical staff appreciated her expertise without questioning her background, accepting her credentials and capabilities as sufficient qualification for the challenging work that defined emergency medicine in a major metropolitan area. The soldiers from the C-130 emergency had recovered completely, their injuries healed through the kind of advanced trauma care that her immediate intervention had made possible. Sergeant Morrison had returned to duty with his unit, while Corporal Jackson and Private Williams had been medically retired with full benefits and appropriate recognition for their service. Their survival represented the best possible outcome for Sarah's decision to reveal her true capabilities, proving that some choices transcended personal security when American lives hung in the balance. Tom Bradley had been promoted to Regional Airport Manager following his exemplary coordination of emergency services during the C-130 crisis. Though he still wondered occasionally about the quiet inventory clerk whose transformation had saved 14 lives and prevented a catastrophe that could have destroyed his airport and endangered civilian residents. Janet Walsh had received commendations for her air traffic control work during the emergency, while Dave Morrison and Bob Williams had been recognized for their rapid response and effective coordination with military personnel under extremely challenging conditions. The Riverside Municipal Airport had been completely rebuilt with federal funding that improved runway capacity, emergency equipment, and communication systems far beyond anything the small facility had previously possessed. The improvements were officially justified as necessary infrastructure upgrades for regional aviation safety, but everyone involved understood that the federal investment represented recognition of the exceptional emergency response that had prevented a potential disaster. The airport now served as a regional emergency response center capable of handling military aircraft emergencies with professional-grade equipment and trained personnel. Colonel Hayes had been promoted to Brigadier General and assigned to command medical evacuation operations for the entire Pacific region. Her exceptional leadership during the C-130 emergency, having demonstrated capabilities that earned recognition at the highest levels of military medical command. Her official reports about the civilian coordinator, whose intervention had saved lives, had been classified and sealed, preventing public recognition, but ensuring that appropriate authorities understood the true circumstances of the successful emergency response. Agent Webb and Agent Collins had received commendations for their investigation into unauthorized intelligence operations, their careful handling of a sensitive witness having provided the evidence necessary for congressional oversight actions that restored accountability to classified programs. Their professional discretion and security protocols had protected Dr. Elena Rodriguez's new identity while ensuring that her testimony could be used effectively in ongoing investigations and oversight activities. The broader implications of Sarah's case had influenced policy changes that strengthened congressional oversight of classified military operations, while improving protection for personnel who reported unauthorized activities or institutional misconduct. New whistleblower protection protocols had been established specifically for intelligence community personnel, while oversight committees had been granted expanded authority to investigate programs that operated outside normal authorization channels. Dr. Elena Rodriguez maintained minimal contact with her previous life, understanding that complete separation was necessary for security, but occasionally monitoring news reports about developments in congressional oversight and intelligence community reform. Her testimony had contributed to systemic changes that improved accountability and transparency, but she knew that powerful interests continued to oppose meaningful oversight and that her security depended on maintaining distance from ongoing political conflicts over intelligence, community governance, the medical work that now defined her professional identity provided the kind of meaningful service that had originally motivated her military career. Treating trauma casualties whose injuries challenged the capabilities of civilian emergency medicine, while training younger physicians in advanced techniques that could save lives under extreme conditions. Her combat medicine experience had proven invaluable in civilian trauma care, demonstrating that military medical training could benefit civilian healthcare when properly applied to emergency medicine challenges. On quiet evenings in her apartment, overlooking Elliott Bay, Dr. Elena Rodriguez sometimes watched military aircraft approaching McCord Air Force Base and remembered the satisfaction of commanding sophisticated fighters through complex operations at speeds and altitudes that challenged human capabilities. But she had learned to find different forms of satisfaction in work that mattered, service that helped people, and the knowledge that her testimony had contributed to reforms that protected other personnel from the institutional pressures that had forced her own disappearance from official military records. The woman who had been Captain Isabella Martinez and Sarah Chen had discovered that identity mattered less than purpose, that recognition was less important than effectiveness, and that the most meaningful victories often occurred in quiet moments, when expert knowledge and careful preparation enabled someone to save lives that might otherwise be lost. Dr. Elena Rodriguez understood that some promises transcended official identity or career advancement, and that the oath to serve and protect could be honored regardless of name, position, or public recognition. The congressional oversight reforms that had resulted from her testimony continued to evolve, strengthening accountability while protecting national security interests that required operational security and classified protection. Her case had demonstrated that whistleblower protection could coexist with legitimate security requirements when proper protocols were established and maintained by agencies committed to both transparency and operational effectiveness. As she prepared for another shift in the emergency department where her trauma surgery skills would be tested against casualties whose injuries challenged the capabilities of civilian medical teams, Dr. Elena Rodriguez knew that her service continued in different forms, but with the same fundamental commitment to saving American lives when expert intervention could make the difference between life and death, regardless of the personal cost or official recognition that such service might or might not receive. 3 years later, Dr. Elena Rodriguez received an encrypted message that made her hands tremble as she read it in the quiet of her apartment. The text was brief but unmistakable. "Phoenix, we have a situation. American hostages in hostile territory. Medical extraction required. Your country needs you one more time." The sender was Colonel Hayes, now General Hayes, and the mission was exactly the kind of classified operation that had originally made Captain Isabella Martinez legendary among Special Operations Forces. Somewhere in a place that didn't officially exist, American personnel were trapped and wounded, beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations. They needed someone with her unique combination of combat aviation skills and advanced trauma medicine expertise. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, then looked out her window at the lights of Seattle reflecting on the dark water. She had found peace in her new life, satisfaction in her civilian medical work, and safety in her carefully constructed anonymity. But the oath she had taken 20 years ago didn't have an expiration date, and some promises transcended personal security or comfortable retirement. She typed her response with steady fingers. "Phoenix confirms." Send coordinates, as she began. Packing equipment she had hoped never to use again. Dr. Elena Rodriguez felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with serving something greater than herself. The woman who had been officially dead twice was about to prove that some people could never really die, as long as American lives hung in the balance. And someone with the right skills was willing to answer the call, sometimes the most extraordinary. Heroes are the ones who keep coming back, no matter what it costs them. What did you think of this incredible story of hidden heroism and sacrifice? Have you ever encountered someone whose true story completely surprised you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of everyday heroes who do extraordinary things when it matters most. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest videos.